I'm going to write some letters for half an hour, and I'm not to be disturbed, said the Professor to his housekeeper, arranging his 5 pairs of glasses nice and neatly on his forehead for when he wanted to use them. Oh, and I'll have a cup of tea when I'm finished, please. Yes, sir, said Mrs. Flittersnoop, and she went into the kitchen to finish reading her book. The clock on the mantelpiece said 4 o'clock as the Professor fastened the safety pins that he had on his coat because the buttons had fallen off and sat down to write. He wrote to his auntie and his cousin. He wrote to the butcher by mistake about some cabbages, and he wrote to the mayor about a nasty smell. Then he wrote to the BBC and to the laundry to say would they send back 2 buttonholes that were missing from his blue shirt. Oh, only 4:30, he said, looking at the clock. So he wrote one to the water company to say that the water came out of the taps twisted and was this all right. He wrote one to the coal people to say that the coal they sent was all dirty. He sent a picture postcard of himself to his friend Colonel Deadshot of the Catapult Cavaliers, saying he could come to tea on Sunday, and he sent one of Colonel Deadshot to himself to remind him that the Colonel was coming to tea on Sunday, and another to Mrs. Flittersnoop to remind her to get some crumpets because the Colonel liked them. Then he looked at the clock, and it was still 4:30. Well, I must have written those postcards quickly, he said, looking at the clock through his long-sighted spectacles, and he was just wondering what to write next when Mrs. Flittersnoop tapped at the door and came in with a cup of tea and a nice big piece of coconut cake. Please, sir, it's gone 9 o'clock and it's your bath night, she said. Don't be silly, said the Professor, stirring his tea and fishing out his near-sighted glasses that had fallen in. Look at the clock. It's 4:30. It's been 4:30 for quite a long time. Oh, there now, said Mrs. Flittersnoop. If the clock hasn't stopped. Well, if it hasn't stopped, what has it done? Said the Professor, deciding not to have his bath after all, as it was so late. There must be something wrong with it, he went on, forgetting to put sugar in his tea and wishing he'd remembered. I'll take it down to the clockman when I go out to the post. I'll wrap it up for you, sir, said the housekeeper, and she took the clock out, leaving a dusty patch on the mantelpiece where it had stood. Presently, the Professor finished his tea and went out into the kitchen to get the clock. Oh, what a nice, tidy packet, he said, picking up the parcel from the kitchen table, and he was gone before Mrs. Flittersnoop, who was in the middle of a chapter, could tear herself away and tell him he'd taken a bag of potatoes by mistake, and that the clock was on the hall stand. When he got to the clockman's shop, it was shut, but the clockman knew him, so he let him in. Please, this clock has stopped, said the Professor. He put down the parcel, cut the string, and all the potatoes burst out, rolled across the counter, and went bouncing and bobbing all over the floor. Oh, dear me, said the Professor, wondering whether clocks always turned into potatoes when they stopped, and that if they did, how very awkward it was.
That's 17 little ones and 6 big ones,
said the clockman, who'd been crawling round the shop picking up the potatoes.
23 all told. Is that all?
I'd better come back in the morning, said the Professor. So the clockman went to bed, and the Professor went back with the potatoes and dropped absolutely several of them on the way. Next day he took the stopped clock to the clockman, who looked at it through a little spyglass, tapped it, and turned it upside down, listened to it, smelt it, scratched about inside it with a hairpin, and warmed it over the gas.
It wants winding, he said. That's why it stopped, and that'll be 5 halfpenny.
But the Professor hadn't listened to him any further than,
it wants winding.
He was scratching his head with one finger and saying to himself, wants winding. Now, why should it want winding up? Because it has run down. What one wants is a clock that doesn't run down and therefore doesn't have to be wound up. Now, someone ought to invent a clock like that. Invent? Why, who invents things? Well, professors do, of course, and aren't I a professor? Yes, I am, so I'll invent a clock that doesn't need winding up. And he was just going to rush out of the shop when the clockman caught him by the coat-tails.
I say, he said, while you're about it, you might invent one of those clocks that don't run down for me, will you? And we'll say no more about the fivepence halfpenny.
So the professor said all right, he would invent 2 clocks, one for himself and one for the clockman, and he went off to invent them, saying no more about the fivepence halfpenny. On Sunday, when Colonel Deadshot came to tea, both the clocks were ready, even though he came immediately after breakfast. The Colonel always came to tea early, so as not to be late.
And you mean to say those clocks will keep on going and telling the time right without ever being wound up?
Said the Colonel, and he listened patiently while the Professor explained. And now, we'll take one of the clocks down to the clockman I promised it to, said the Professor.
Hooray,
said the clockman when he saw it.
Thanks ever so, but I'll bet it runs down and has to be wound up all the same.
No, it won't, said the Professor. Not if you don't touch it, you see. The Professor and the Colonel were just having dinner together when something happened. The Professor's beautiful, marvellous and amazing never-stop clock went and struck 13. Ding, 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 ding. "Grr, said the Colonel with his mouth full, quite forgetting his manners, he was so astonished.
Is it meant to do that, or has it got a pain in its cogwheels?
I shouldn't worry, sir, if I was you, put in Mrs. Flittersnoop, who'd come in with a nice rice pudding. Clocks is funny things. I remember my sister Aggie had one that wouldn't go unless it was on its face. And then, when it struck 13 and the hands said 2:45, you knew it was 5 o'clock.
Oh, dear.
Let's run down to the clockman and see if his clock has struck 13 too, said the Professor at last. And he dashed out of the house without waiting to put on his hat or even to take his napkin out of his collar, where he always tucked it in at meal-times. When they got to the clockman's, he was all bothered and astonished too, because his clock had just struck 14. I see what I've done. Yes, I do. I forgot all about the striking business, went on the Professor, taking no notice of either the clockman or the Colonel. I've made the clocks so as they'll go on forever and never need winding, and of course I've made them so as they go on striking forever and not need winding, only I forgot to put a little wiggly thing in, and instead of starting to strike 1 again after they've struck 12, those clocks will go on striking 13, 14, 15, and so on till they're striking goodness knows how many. Oh, dear. And he sank wearily into a chair. Only the Colonel had just taken the chair to sit on, so he sat bump on the floor instead. Oh, this is awful, he went on, getting all worked up but forgetting to get up. The clocks will go on striking 15, 16, 17, 18, and on and on and on.
And every hour they'll strike more and more,
put in the clockman, just to show that he knew all about clocks. And soon they'll be striking so many strikes that they won't have time to finish striking 1 hour before it's time to begin striking the next. And what's going to happen then? Oh, dear, cried the Professor. Oh, I must do something to the clock I've got somehow. I must. And getting up, he rushed back to his house again, and he started trying to get the clock open. He tried the screwdriver and the saw, and he tried chisels, and he tried the tin opener, but none of them was any good. Then he tried lots of tools of his own invention, and they weren't any good either. For days and days he tried, and Mrs. Flittersnoop got tired of waiting dinner for him and went to stay with her sister Aggie for a bit. Then the clock struck ding 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 ding. Well, anyway, it was 85, and in despair the Professor started biting it, and that wasn't any good either. And before long, the never-stop clock was going ding 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 ding. all the time without a pause.
Oh, dear, I'll never invent a clock again. No, I won't,
gasped the Professor, now tired out and weary. And then there was a knock at the door, and the clockman's little girl came in to say that Father said that their clock was humming.
Humming?
Said the Professor.
Clocks don't hum.
Oh, yes, of course. Yes, it's striking so many that it hasn't time to catch itself up, and it has to keep on striking quicker and quicker, so that it goes ding, 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 all the time.
Yes,
Said the clockman's little girl.
that's just how it is going.
Go and tell your father to come and see me. There was a loud bang in the distance, and the next minute the clockman dropped out of the sky right onto the calceolarias. Oh, you needn't have hurried so, said the Professor. But the clockman was waving his arms and trying to say everything at once, and his clothes were all torn, and his face was all dirty.
I say, the clock.
He managed to stammer out at last.
It went bang. It started humming. It hummed and got shriller and shriller, and then it went bang, and here I am.
Good heavens, cried the Professor, clutching at a hollyhock to steady himself. Of course. It kept striking quicker and quicker to catch itself up, and the quicker it struck, the shriller it would make it hum, and... He stopped suddenly. From the house came a shrill, wailing screech.
The clock!
Yelled the Professor.
It's going to go bang, and my clock is a much bigger one than yours. And if yours blew you all the way here, whatever will happen if my bigger clock goes bang?
They dashed into the house. Whee! The Professor dashed to the mantelpiece. Whee! He grabbed the screaming clock and dashed out of the window, forgetting to open it first and smashing the glass. Crash! Crash! All over the place. Down the road he rushed through Great Pagwell, past the ruins of the clockman's house that his clock had blown up. Whee! And down to Lower Pagwell, with the clock shrieking and screeching. Whee! And getting shriller at every stride. He passed Mrs. Flittersnoop, who was on the way back to see if he was ready for dinner yet. But when she saw him and heard the clock, she went back to her sister Aggie's again. Over the hedge dashed the Professor, and down to the lake went the clock. The Professor drew back his hand and hurled it as far as ever he could, which wasn't very far. And then he turned and he rushed back. The clock burst with a terrific crash and blew up so much water from the lake that everyone in Lower Pagwell got a bath, even though it wasn't his bath night.
Oh, dear, I am sorry about your house being all busted,
said the Professor to the clockman.
but I'll invent you a new one, shall I?
But the clockman said he'd rather invent his own house.
Thank you very much, all the same.